Have a fabulous weekend and welcome back to NASREC, everybody. So we are here and just looking around, there doesn't seem to be much happening at the moment, and already the conference are running late, and it has been for a few days now, but it seems as though today will be no different. The question is, how late will we be running? Angelo, Fick, you've been with me all morning, and you were actually just observing how quiet it is outside.
Absolutely. Usually at this point one can see people trading ANC regalia outside, and you can begin to see people milling around waiting to enter the hall. I'm not seeing that. But also the fact that it is running late by days and now hours, as you pointed out, may be an indication of some of the behind the scenes at the museum stuff that has to happen.
So before we went back to studio, I was in conversation with Mamoloko Kubai and talking about economic recovery within the African National Congress. Now, what was your observation in terms of what the point she was making about the strides the ANC have made, but also the criticism that has been leveled against them with regard to macroeconomic policy?
And not just macroeconomic policy, but running the state as a whole. So we must not forget that the ANC has the kind of mandate and electoral return percentages that people elsewhere in the world look at with envy, that they're still very much close to 60, that they've had a two-thirds majority. So the state as we live in it really has been built by the ANC post-1994. And they have to take some responsibility for failures of policy formulation, failures of regulation, failures of active positive change making. They wish to only claim, and it's important that we acknowledge, some of the positive elements that have happened since 1994, and there is no denying that there have been massive strides made by the post-apartheid polity because of ANC policy. But alongside that, they also have to face their failures. The fact that the economy looks the way it does is not just the consequence of the 2008 economic crisis, the COVID pandemic, and the current unfolding potential recession. It is also the consequence of corruption, the consequence of maladministration, the consequence of cadre deployment resulting in the wrong cadres being deployed, and the kinds of concerns they have with so-called lumpen elements currently sitting inside government structures These are issues that they have to take some responsibility for. After all, they defended their policies very strongly in 2014, in 2015, in 2016, in 2019, and even as late as 2021.
So speaking of lumpen elements and, just reading through the discussion documents, that was one of the other criticisms, that the way, the style, the grammar, just from a point of gravitas, these documents have been criticized. Absolutely,
and I empathize with people like Mamoloko Kubai. This is a sticky wicket they sit in. If you're a true believer, if you really have your entire life invested in the African National Congress as this, century-old organization, if your entire life is shaped by this, what the last decade must have done to your sense of self must be, quite devastating. That there are true believers, ordinary people, who are invested in this as not just a space to self-realize in economic terms, but to self-realize in spiritual and other forms, intellectual forms. And so the falling apart of the organization in the way it has is crucially, I think, difficult for such people. But to go back to the issue of what we make of this document, I think it speaks to part of that problem. This is the party, this is the organization that that has a legacy of intellectuals like Saul Plaatje, like Z.K. Matthews, like, A.B. Kluma, thinkers, whatever you make of him as a human being, thinkers in his writing like Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo, Anton Lembede, Govan Mbeki. You now sit with a situation where there's a document that misspells people's names, that misquotes them, that puts their quotations out of context, that uses casual language by referring to people as hustlers and drunkards. And you sort of think that there is something bricolage-like about this, that there is some kind of weird postmodern version of the ANC, which is that it takes bits and pieces from everywhere and puts them into the same arrangement and doesn't care to make them fit well together in this document. And that, I think, is something that is a symptom of the malaise the organization is in. This document should have been far more carefully produced. The errors shouldn't be there. And the grammar errors and the spelling errors are not, moments of superficial. They shift meaning, and they show the care or lack of care taken in communicating to the mass inside the party what the party's discussion points should be, could be, and how it is communicated.
You earlier spoke about Marxist theory, and you basically touched on the fact that it seems as though people stopped reading in 1980. Well, I'm listening to you speaking of and regaling the names of former, past ANC leaders. So did you stop at a certain point as well? Has the ANC not produced any leaders worth mentioning beyond that point?
This is what one has to ask. Where are the equivalents of people writing those kinds of letters? So if you think of the Thabo Mbeki letters from the last few years, if that's the high point of intellectual achievement, and I'm not critiquing Mr. Mbeki here, the question is, will we be reading those the way in which we read Z.K. Matthews' Freedom for My People? Decades on, the way we continue to read A.B. Kluma for an understanding not just of the dynamics of the time of and in which he writes, but of the time in and of which we live, that is questionable. And I think the paucity of that intellectual tradition has been because of the, shall we say, luxury of being in government. If you have control over the levers of power, and the document points this out, where it quotes Oliver Tambo from 1977 saying, if you think it's difficult fighting a liberation war, it's going to be even more difficult once you have control in government. And the fact that we have had such a paucity of theorization, the fact that the people writing these things are not reading contemporary debates in Marxism. There's no Mike Davis. There is absolutely no David Graeber. There is nothing from the post-Soviet collapse discussions of Marxism, whether through psychoanalysis and Zizek, or whether through feminist critiques or other critiques. This speaks to, I think, a real poverty of the intellectual tradition in the ANC because of the increase of patronage networks, money politics, and the concern with resources to control and manage wealth creation and patronage networks rather than the political education that the party raises again and again.
So we're running out of time, and I just want to take a huge leap from what you're saying to look at things like arts and culture and sport, and how that seems to be a little footnote once again. What is it about the African National Congress and its alliance partners that doesn't recognize the importance of arts and culture in terms of transformation of society?
I think it is a real problem because it wasn't always the case. One must not forget the ANC's culture desk and the work of people like Mungani Serote in it. But what we've since seen is a reduction of arts and culture to panoply, to the kinds of games and shall we say, spectacular elements. So it's a flag post for national unity. It's a hero's acre. No attention paid in the document in any great depth to the importance of national languages, to children's ability to have those languages visible to them in supermarket aisles, on road signs, in public spaces, to see that theirs are not just languages of vernacular interaction, those are official languages in which meaning can be expressed. The bringing of the world to those children by translating the world's texts into those languages, whether it's television or film or whether it is novels. A child sitting in Guyana should be able to read Don Quixote in Chivenda. A child sitting somewhere in the middle of the Free State should be able to read all sorts of things in Sesotho. After all, Sol Plaatje translated Shakespeare into Setswana. This is not an organization that doesn't have that tradition. And the fact that the Minister of Arts and Culture, a deployee of the party, sits in the position that he's in and has this very spectacular idea of arts and culture as you go to the airport to welcome back a football team, but it isn't backed up by actual processes by which ordinary girls can learn and have safety in the playing of football, in which football clubs are supported at school level, and an integration of basic education with aspects of arts and culture. That, I think, is part of the tragedy of a culture desk inside a party that has lost its power when the party came to run government.
So, of course, broad strokes discussions that we are having at the moment, but there will be much more deliberation. And Angelo, I would think, as that takes place in plenary, it will also allow us to perhaps run through more discursively through some of these points in these discussion documents. I say I, but I'm about to step out. I'm sure you will be here for the rest of the day as SABC News continues to bring you coverage of the 6th policy conference of the African National Congress taking place at Nasrec. And as I just turn to look to my right, nothing has changed. It's still very quiet, very few people about, and the conference, I can tell you right now, is running late, but we'll continue to keep you up to speed. Thanks to Angelo, Fick, and of course, this is where I say goodbye from Morning Live, and it's over to the agenda.